Welcome to Movie Lovers Club. Our protagonist Jimmy Livingston is born with no immunity at all. He must maintain isolation since even a small amount of bacteria can kill him. He is unable to touch anything without first decontaminating it. In order to survive, he will have to spend his entire existence within a bubble-like plastic sphere. Mrs. Livingston, his mother, is too protective of her son. In fact, he wasn't even permitted to return home until he was 4 years old. She and Mr. Livingston bring the youngster home in his bubble once he turns 4. He can enter his room because it too has a sizable bubble around it. His parents can touch him through a pair of protruding hands installed in the bubble. All of his toys are kept inside the bubble after being thoroughly cleaned to remove even the tiniest of germs. Since then, Jimmy has been living in that room. Mrs. Livingston finishes every bedtime story with the princess dying because she was set free because she never wants him to leave the bubble. He is only permitted to watch one television station and read one magazine due to Mrs. Livingston's insistence that they are the only ones ever produced. As Mrs. Livingston is an extreme nationalist, she forces her views on Jimmy and only teaches him what she feels is reasonable. Poor Jimmy doesn't know any better, so he just goes along. The peculiar bubble child is well known across the city, but this is not to his benefit. Instead, the neighborhood youngsters disguise themselves in plastic wrap and tease Jimmy in front of his house. Mrs. Livingston constantly chases them away. Jimmy only consumes home-cooked meals. Mrs. Livingston puts his food in a plastic tube with a decontamination mechanism in it to eliminate the bacteria before Jimmy can get it. Jimmy has reached the age of 16. He was thrilled to receive an electric guitar rather than a car up until the day he spots Khloe, a new girl of his age, moving into his neighborhood while standing in front of his window. He has no experience with either love or girls. Jimmy's mother tells him the tale of the boy who died after touching the next-door whore after sensing Jimmy's adoration. Jimmy spends the following few years closely observing Khloe via his windows. She is also aware of his attention to her. Jimmy is mocked by Khloe's pals, who refer to him as the bubble boy. She seems to be defensive towards him. Khloe knocks on the Livingston's door one day, and Mr. Livingston lets her in. She becomes fascinated when she notices the extensive network of plastic tubes throughout the house. She follows the tube until she arrives in Jimmy's room. Jimmy is taken aback and uneasy because he has only spoken to his mother. When Khloe speaks to him, she compliments him on his guitar. Jimmy makes an attempt to show her how to play it with the exposed hands. The two have been hanging together every day since that day. Although Mrs. Livingston dislikes their friendship, she is powerless to intervene. They continue spending time together. She even invites children into his room for Halloween and offers him a guinea pig and a ball for his birthday. On her birthday, Khloe enters Jimmy's room through the windows while drunk. She attempts entering the bubble while claiming she is unable to avoid him any longer. But before she can enter, she faints. The scene cuts to Khloe's prom night. Jimmy is upset when her disgusting lover Mark arrives to fetch her up. Jimmy accepts Mark's offer of a cigarette, although he is unsure of what it is. Khloe enters Jimmy's room the very following day to show him her engagement ring. She had received a marriage proposal from Mark. She has come to tell Jimmy that they will get married this weekend at Niagara Falls. Jimmy is disappointed, but he doesn't express it. Jimmy doesn't care about the gift she gave him and placed inside his decontamination tube. Instead, he returns the guinea pig to her and asks her to leave. With tears in her eyes, Khloe departs. Later, as Jimmy opens the present, he discovers a "I love you" snow globe inside. He yells her name in shock and decides to travel to Niagara Falls to prevent the wedding. He makes a portable bubble shield for himself after much effort, and it works. Then, without his parents' knowledge, he sneaks out of the house. Jimmy, who is excited to be running for the first time, arrives at the bus stop and approaches a passerby to request a bus ticket. He is struck by a bus as he tries to cross the street in a distressed state. His bubble saves him as he falls to the ground. He is offered a ride by the bus passengers. Jimmy takes it happily but learns later that the group is a religious cult. When he points it out, they angrily throw him out of the bus. When the cult group reaches their destination, the leader announces the guy inside the globe to be the rescuer of God. When the group realizes that Jimmy was their savior, they go in search of him to free him from the globe. In the meantime, Jimmy encounters a biker called Slim. Jimmy tells him that the love of his life is marrying another person. Slim, who is impressed by Jimmy, tells him about his ex-girlfriend named Wildfire whom he still adores. The two travel together to Niagara Falls. Mrs. Livingston panics when she discovers Jimmy is missing. Mr. and Mrs. Livingston began their search for Jimmy because it would take the police 24 hours to investigate Jimmy's disappearance. Slim and Jimmy arrive in Vegas and take a break. They have a lot of fun at a casino, but Jimmy only has 2 days before the wedding. So, he leaves Slim at the club, steals a scooter, and runs away in it. After some time, Jimmy finally encounters his parents' vehicle, who attempt to stop him from fleeing. Jimmy gets into an accident. Fortunately, his bubble bounces him into a running train. He manages to get away from his mother, but he finds himself now trapped in a train with talents from a freak show. The freaks inform him that Dr. Freak, their employer, keeps them imprisoned and utilizes them in his freak show. Jimmy meets Dr. Freak, a dwarf. With his bubble, he unintentionally knocks the man to the ground while freeing the other freaks. Then he keeps traveling toward Niagara Falls. However, he realizes that he can hardly operate a scooter any longer, so he goes to a restaurant to manage a ride. A man named Push Pop is bullied by a group of police officers. When Jimmy informs them that he has no immunity, they immediately believe he is infected and flee the area. In the chaos, the restaurant catches fire, and Push Pop offers Jimmy a ride to Niagara Falls. When Mrs. Livingston contacts Dr. Freak, he informs her that Jimmy is traveling to Niagara Falls. She calls Khloe in a rage and shouts at her for making Jimmy run. While talking with Dr. Freak, the freaks outside steal her car. Push Pop and Jimmy hit a cow in the middle of the road. Push Pop is upset since cows are a symbol of God and his religion, but Jimmy tells him his mother says religion is not true. Push Pop is offended by this, so he abandons Jimmy. Jimmy hardly makes it to New York. He approaches an elderly guy by the name of Pippi and begs for a ride, to which he agrees. The following morning when Jimmy awakens, the man is still driving the car. Jimmy soon realizes that Pippi is lying lifeless, and the car hits a billboard. Jimmy makes a call to Khloe. Mark receives the call and tells Jimmy to give up because he is about to wed Khloe in an hour. Jimmy feels hopeless and calls his mother. He wants her to come get him up. His parents both arrive by car and help him get into the vehicle. Mr. Livingston asks Jimmy how it felt to be outside for the first time as Mrs. Livingston leaves for the restroom. Mr. Livingston advised Jimmy to never give up without trying. Jimmy likes his advice and runs to stop the wedding. When Mrs. Livingston notices this, they drive after him. The cult group also locates Jimmy at this moment and pursues him. Along with his motorcycle buddies, Slim arrives to save Jimmy. Slim and Mrs. Livingston, who also happens to be his ex-girlfriend Wildfire, lock eyes. It turns out that they are all driving on a plane's runway. Jimmy boards a flight together with an old pilot. Jimmy falls into the Niagara Falls during their flight to Niagara Falls due to a plane disaster. Fortunately, his bubble prevents him from drowning. He emerges from the water, then hurries to the wedding. As Khloe and Mark exchange vows in the chapel, Jimmy walks in and declares his love for her. He puts his life in jeopardy and breaks his bubble open to kiss Khloe since he knows this is his last chance to convince her. But immediately after, he loses consciousness. Mr. and Mrs. Livingston also make their way to the wedding as Khloe tries to wake him. While Mrs. Livingston mourns her son's death, Mr. Livingston asks her to tell everyone the truth. Mrs. Livingston embarrassingly reveals that Jimmy doesn't have any condition. Suddenly Jimmy wakes up. It turns out that she had been lying to him for all these years in order to shield him from the miseries of the outside world. When his mother says that she did it to keep him safe, Jimmy is shocked but forgives her. Jimmy finally embraces Khloe as everyone claps. In the final scene, Jimmy and Khloe are getting married. Everyone he encountered on his travels is present at the wedding. Jimmy and Khloe are seen leaving in a car for their honeymoon as the film comes to an end. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe and share your thoughts in the comment section.